passion, commitment, patience, vision. These are the lessons you'll learn from 12 master photographers who cover the world for National Geographic magazine. You'll see how they research and plan a shoot, work a scene, and wait for just the right elements of an image and make the most of light, composition, and moment. In the adventure section of the course, Corey Richards takes you high into the Himalayas and deep under the sea, combining the stories of his expeditions with explorations of the cultures in which they take place. With Stephen Alvarez, you visit places no one has ever seen before, from the world's largest and deepest caves to the highest spikes of the singing limestone pinnacles of Madagascar. In the wildlife section, Steve Winter demonstrates how understanding an animal's behavior helps you compose your pictures in advance. Joel Sartori then shows you how to apply your knowledge of light and composition to take wildlife photographs that make a real-world difference to the natural world. In the landscape section, Jim Richardson takes you from the Hebrides of Scotland to the American West as he experiments with different ways to work a shot. Michael Yamashita draws parallels between the work of Japanese gardeners and landscape photographers, showing how both use the elements of light and color to direct the eye around a frame. To make photos that give insight into the human condition, Jody Cobb explains how she gains access to hidden worlds, from geisha houses in Japan to the tents of Bedouin women in the desert of Saudi Arabia. Ira Block describes how he builds relationships with his subjects and shows you how to capture interesting shots of people working or playing in their environments. In a section on color and light, Michael Melford discusses the 4 kinds of light photographers look for, but also demonstrates that it's possible to work with any kind of light, given enough planning and perseverance. Annie Griffiths communicates the joy of experimenting with color, exploring its many personalities to evoke emotional reactions in the viewer. Finally, in storytelling, William Albert Allard brings his 50 years of experience to bear, showing you how to incorporate place and moment in the stories you tell through photographs. Ed Cashy discusses types of storytelling, from his own advocacy journalism to the personal visual journaling made possible by today's digital photography tools. Together, these 12 master photographers will take you on a visual journey around the world, sharing their secrets to capturing great images.
Hi, I'm Chris Johns, National Geographic's Chief Content Officer. It's my pleasure to introduce the Masters of Photography course. This course would have been so helpful to me early in my career. I'll recall one of my first stories, a story on Frederick Remington, the famous Western artist. What I needed to do was take photographs that not only told the story of Frederick Remington, but could actually complement the great artwork that he had done. I had to take my storytelling to a whole different level. So I went from just being a photojournalist telling a story to taking my pictures to another level artistically. So by studying the great masters, like Bill Allard, who in his own way has made powerful Western photographs, and now today, young photographers like Corey Richards and their new innovative ways of telling stories, we can learn together. We can find our own path, and we can start to refine our own voice, our own way of seeing, our own vision. So come along on this journey and let our masters help you find your own voice.
Hi, I'm Corey Richards. I'm a National Geographic photographer and I've been climbing for about 30 years. Early on, my photography was all about climbing. That's all I really cared about. That's what I did. I wanted to give people a feeling of being above the clouds, putting little people in big landscapes to try to tell that awe-inspiring story of what it felt like to be on adventures. Adventures, that's what I did. That's all that mattered. That's how I translated my experience with life. I wanted to show what it felt like to be up on a high, high place in a very ominous situation. Give people a sense of fear. Give them a sense of wonder, what it feels like to be above all the clouds, to be in the highest mountains of the world. What does that feel like? What does that look like? But as I moved through that, I started to realize that honestly, these kinds of pictures, as much as I love making them, as much as they create a sense of awe and inspiration, they weren't quite enough for me. I wanted to tell bigger stories about what it felt like to be in the mountains, what it felt like to be sleeping under a Himalayan sky. This is one of my earlier images where I really used creative lighting to try and figure that out, try to tell people that story, using a smaller aperture to make the moon look like the sun, but you still get the stars. You get the end of the day light sweeping across the south face of Nuptse. And a speed light, just a little bit of a flash in the tent that lights it up, gives you that sense of being there. This was one of my early attempts at trying to show people, this is what it feels like to be on adventures. But as I grew into that, I started to care more and more about the people that I was with. What they felt like to be on an adventure, what it felt like to be freezing cold, what it felt like to put yourself up against something very, very difficult. And certainly, as that started to transform for me, I started to care deeply about the cultures I was engaging in, where I was visiting, what I was seeing. Some of my earliest trips to Nepal were life-altering for me. I was trying to figure out how to shoot and translate this cultural landscape. So not just the mountains, not just the climbing, but really what it felt like to be in this place. How do I translate those smells? These are these chortens, these big, big religious monuments that are all over Nepal, and the prayer flags blowing in the wind. This was one of my earlier photos that I think actually successfully worked to tell that story. I generally don't use fisheye lenses, but in this case I chose to because I wanted to get this big sweeping expanse, right? To get the mountains behind, the houses over here, and I moved just a little bit around to find that perfect sweet spot to get that sun kissing around the chorten. Because it really just brings your eyes in to meet the eyes of Buddha here. And that was when I really started to care about the culture. And so it was making pictures of culture and climbing and adventure, all of that bringing it together to really tell that human story. This is a portrait of one of my friends, Karma Searing. He's an elder of a village called Phortse in Nepal. I spent days with Karma trying to figure out how to get close enough to him, how to create that intimate rapport where I could spend time with him days and days and days to create pictures like this that tell that story, not of climbing mountains, not of necessarily just what it feels like to be in that place, but who lives there. And that creates the richness of all of adventure. Who you're there with, who lives there to begin with, what it's all about, what those mountains look like. This was the first time where I really started to experiment with intimacy and started to view adventure as a larger, bigger context. I came to Geographic as an adventure photographer. That's how I was noticed by them. And one of my very biggest adventure assignments with National Geographic was going to Antarctica, the bottom of the planet. It's one of the most incredibly mysterious and beautiful landscapes I've ever seen. And all the images that I was trying to create down there, I was trying to convey that sense of place. That was really what mattered to me down there. As much as it was about climbing, it was also about what it looks like to live down there. As you land in Novo, which is this Russian base, it's basically just a bunch of, old containers on wheels. And I wanted to give that sense of, this is a very desolate, isolated place. And people do live here. It was a part of the story to me that was very, very fascinating. You've got these big, containers on wheels. This is where people live. I love this big welcome sign, right? I mean, welcome to Antarctica. That's kind of funny. As I started to go down there, as I started to work in Antarctica, I really wanted to look for those unexpected moments because so often we know what to expect in Antarctica. But a big welcome sign, well, that's kind of different, right? And it's a very, very mysterious place in that way. And it's also kind of humorous. This image I really worked hard to create that sense of mystery, keep it mysterious, but also playful. welcome to Antarctica, but I let it be a very slow shutter drag to give that sense of motion as two people walked through the frame. I waited for that right moment. I have other frames where, just one person is walking this way. But to me, I really felt like, I wanted to have more than one person. I wanted to show that people were living down there, but I also wanted to show sort of the humorous side of that while maintaining that sort of ominous sense. Big dark sky, end of the day light. It was kind of a fun exercise in how do I tell this story of people, of the Russians living on this isolated base and giving that sense of place. And immediately moving into, and now how do I tell that sense of adventure and awe? Using very, very creative kind of lighting, natural lighting. Oftentimes it's not the best thing to do to shoot straight into the sun, but I found myself doing it a lot in Antarctica because what it does is it gives you this beautiful backlight through this blowing snow. And that to me sort of gave you that sense of where am I? I mean, these guys are on skis, but it looks like the desert. And really what happens down there is sunrise and sunset sort of coalesce into this 6-hour extravaganza of beautiful light. And I found myself trying to use that light as often as possible. I also wanted to give that sense of the relatable parts of adventure, of what it feels like to shelter yourself, be in a tent. Adventure is so often, just like we've talked about, being outside and doing that hard thing. But there's so much more to it. It's those relatable human moments when you go into your tent, when you're sheltering yourself from what's happening out here, and you start looking at what's happening in here. You start looking at all the details, the gummy bears in the bottle, right? They're playing chess on this makeshift chessboard, right? All of that stuff. I love the thought on Freddie's face here. It's trying to find that little moment in the day that everybody can relate to, because not everybody can relate to being in Antarctica. So when you make pictures, you want to find things that everybody can relate to. They can be like, I get that. I know what it feels like to play chess. I know what it feels like to try and escape, to go inside, to be sheltered. And I don't think that this shot itself is a perfect tent shot. It's not the perfect execution of that. I tried very hard down there. I had a lot of time to try and do it. But I don't think it is. If I was going to say, let's look at the perfect tent shot, it would be something a little bit more like this. This is a shot that I took in Nepal, actually, just to step back. And the reason I want to show it is because when you compare the two, this is much more technically right on. This is a technically perfect shot. You've got the right color palettes, the yellow, the blue. She's wearing the right color. You've got this backlight coming in through here, illuminating the steam. All of that is technically perfect. And you also have, I knew this was going to come, and I knew the sun was going to go down right here, so I put a speed light in the tent down here that helped light her up. So that's a much more technically sound shot than the other one, but the other one is actually much more human. So when you compare the two, you start to see how the same concept can really have two different characters entirely. But when you talk about being in a tent, you're talking about comfort, you're talking about being in a comfortable situation. You need to juxtapose that against discomfort. And discomfort is a huge part of adventure. In fact, if it's not uncomfortable, it's probably not a very good adventure. And that's part of it. So I also try to focus on those times when you need to get out of the tent, you need to get into the mix, you need to get really amongst it. And this was one of those days where we had to carry gear out in a whiteout across an ice cap and dump it, and it was miserable. It was terrible. And oftentimes those are the times you want to put your camera away. You're like, nah, I want to get in the tent, I want to curl up, I want to listen to some music, that's it. But you can't do that in adventure photography. As soon as it gets hard, that's when you got to take your camera out. That's when you know it's going to get good. Because that's a very relatable experience. And also, isolating somebody like this in that hardship also helps you tell that larger story of the landscape itself, right? Here, when you're looking at these two images together now, this has no landscape. It doesn't need it, right? It doesn't need any of that. This is all about landscape. This is all about the human, and this is all about the place. And when you're telling a story, you need both of those elements. And hopefully you can combine them in this way. But the landscape here is something that I find to be one of the most engaging. I mean, Antarctica's landscape, we talk about mystery, I've said that word a couple times. It is very mysterious. And my experience there really was a turning point where I really started to deeply, deeply care about the things that we have at stake. And I wanted to create pictures that showed that. This is what we have to lose if we're not careful as humans. And I started to look at the landscape in terms of form. How do I use lines, color, to create unexpected moments that still help me move my story along, move it down the line, but are engaging to the eye? This is actually an interesting image to me because of the design, right? So you've got a monochromatic palette. It tells that story of blue. This is a cold, cold place, right? You've got these huge backpacks on these guys, which is hard. But then what I really love is the simplicity of it. Most people think they're looking up into the sky here, but in fact, you're looking down about 500 feet onto a huge sheet of ice. That's interesting. You want to find as much as you can in these landscapes that are either, very simple or very complex, but you want to use the landscape to your advantage. You want to use its form and look for those unexpected moments that help you move your story along without saying too much. This is a very simple frame. You also want to find the immediacy in things. This is a very immediate moment. This is a moment where things are happening. There's a lot of wind. It's pushing hard. You can tell that we're trying to hide ourselves behind this rock. It was one of those times where, again, I didn't want to go shoot right then. I wanted to get in that tent. It was so cold. It was so actually quite scary. I mean, our tents were getting collapsed. There was a lot of snow building up against them. I didn't know how that night was going to turn out. And being in Antarctica, it's very isolated. Things really can't go wrong. You have to be very, very self-reliant. But this image to me, even though it did run in the magazine, was not. I didn't like it as much as some of the others. There is that immediacy. You can see the wind blowing. You can feel it stinging, and you can feel that sort of raging energy. But honestly, to me, this is a little bit better illustration of that. There's a much more complex composition. You can see that motion in Keith here, the way he's like moving back and forth. That is a moment that gives you that sense of immediacy. Something is happening here. And this is the story of that moment, right? You see all the snow in front of him. You've got to use those elements to bring it all together, to tell what it feels like to be cold, what it feels like to feel threatened by the weather. Adventure photography is really about incorporating your environment into the picture so that you start to understand what it feels like to be there. You start to lose this landscape back here to the wind that's coming up and kicking up the snow. I love this image just because it does feel immediate. It feels like something's happening, like we need to get out of here, or we need to get moving, or we need to get into our tent. You're trying to find those moments. And then you need to stop and come in close. That is what this moment is all about. This isn't a perfect composition. This was a hard day out on in a huge whiteout where things were just difficult. I mean, I don't love this composition, but what I do love about it is I can feel what Mike feels here. I can feel the snow on his face, the Band-Aids protecting his cheeks, all of it. This is about that human experience. And then you have to find ways to use composition to tell stories that are not necessarily immediately apparent. Now this image to me, this is a climbing image. This is what I actually think of as a climbing image, a good one. I'm using layering now, which is a much more complex way to tell a story. You're using a lot more layers to tell a climbing story. And the reason I'm doing that is for texture. I want to see the texture in his pants. I want to see how it's pilling. I love this motion of his hand here, right? And then you start to move into Freddie back here, who's putting on all of this gear. It's very, very heavy. And you start to see, wow, climbing in Antarctica, not only does it require a lot of gear, rope, all of this stuff, but I mean, they're wearing all these clothes. It starts to tell that bigger narrative. So you're including a lot of elements to tell that story of climbing without ever showing climbing. That's what's kind of cool about it. But then, of course, you do need the climbing shots. And I love this shot. I think this is another great use of layers. It's a great use of layer and color. I was looking, what I want to basically project here is that I'm not there. This is just happening without me. And so I used the ropes basically to make it feel like I just sort of disappeared, stepped back, and I was shooting through, looking out on this window and getting that big landscape behind them and getting that sense of, wonder and awe that comes with climbing as somebody's leading out from a belay stance. And also all the colors here. I mean, the red against the blue sky, the green rope against this rock, Freddie's bright orange helmet against the blue sky, Mike's red jacket. All of these things come together to start to really tell that bigger climbing narrative. And this is actually a climbing image, right? But again, it's using layers to step through back into the image, make it deeper, make it more complex. And I also like to use basic, very simple compositions sometimes to tell that larger, bigger picture. This is actually not from Antarctica, but I want to talk about it a little bit because the next image will be sort of almost a negative of it. Same composition. I'm using basically big negative spaces, big open spaces to isolate a human and show what this kind of adventure looks like. This is ice climbing in the Canadian Rockies. This was a photograph I took quite early on in my career. It actually was an advertising photograph. It basically just shows through space how massive this experience is and how intimidating it can be. And I've carried that through a lot of my photography throughout the years, these simple compositions placing a human in a big landscape. I think this is a great example of that. In Antarctica, I wanted to do that, but I wanted to do something more with it. We've talked a little bit about using the unexpected. And I was looking for that moment in Antarctica. I took a lot of images similar to this, but the one that really stood out to me was this one. Because this is a very similar composition, but it feels so much bigger. Why does it feel bigger? Well, because now the person is not on the rock or on the ice, the person is out away from it. What you're really incorporating here is landscape. This is all about landscape. And it feels scarier. Why does it feel scarier? Well, because the person isn't attached. The one thing that makes this safe for this human, this Mike right here, is this rope. And we can all relate to somebody hanging very, very far off the ground, right, on this tiny little rope. I mean, it is such a small piece of the frame. And right here, he's 2,000 feet off the ground. This is a simple composition similar to the last frame that really, really utilizes space and negative space specifically to tell that large story of struggle, of adventure, and the human element, how we put ourselves out there. Very simple composition, but very, very, very effective. We've talked about simple compositions, using a small person in a big landscape to isolate somebody. In this case, this frame is actually a little different because I had to wait for a few days to get exactly the right light. I had to know when the sun was going to come around the lip of this cliff and blast across it and create this huge shadow below Alex and really give you the texture of the red rocks, right? That's very important in this frame. And it took days to figure that out. It also is a little bit of an interesting composition, not so much in its simplicity, which we've discussed, but because I've isolated him in this square. If I start to expand on that, you start to have less of a feeling of awe. It's just an illustration of how sometimes you need to find the right spot, wait for the right light, and that can take a while. You need to really be premeditated about some of these things. This is another very simple composition that's more about texture and color. You've got a guy in a bright yellow jacket on really blue ice, right? And it gives you that feeling of precariousness. But sometimes that's not always the best way to make a photograph. I like this photograph. I think it's good. I think it gives people that feeling of ice climbing. But sometimes you want to put people in place by using silhouette. And this, to me, is actually a very effective use of silhouette. It gives that feeling of how small people are in the big, big mountains. That, to me, is very important. You want to tell people how little and finite we are. And silhouette can be a very, very effective way to have an intimate moment, but not so much intimate with the person, but intimate with the landscape, creating layers through it, giving people the sense of awe and wonder by not paying attention so much to that person, right? This helps carry people through a story. It helps give them the feeling of the landscape while placing people in it. You also want to think about color, right? This is a great way to isolate a person in a big landscape that is really very monochromatic. This is mostly blue and white. I use color here to isolate Melissa. So people, your eye goes right there. Another thing that I'm using in this frame is a leading line. This line of the rope. It starts out of focus and it comes right in. It takes your eye right to her. That's a very, very important piece of this frame. If that rope wasn't there, I don't think this frame would be nearly as strong. You know, it's one of those things that we use always, that we try to draw people's eye to where we want it to be. Sometimes in simple compositions like this, it's not as hard to do. In more complex compositions, you have to find ways to do that. Sometimes light is the way you do it. This is a great example of how light draws you right where you want to be. There's two people, and this is the brightest point in the frame. That's all you got to do. That's it. Black and white isn't always the most effective way, or we don't always think of black and white as an effective way to communicate great light. But in this case, this is exactly what it does. Brightest point in the frame, two people. It's very simple. We've talked a little bit about intimacy and human emotion. How do we portray the things that adventure brings out in us? Exhaustion is one of them, right? We get tired when we go on big trips. We get tired when we go on adventures. How do you take a picture that says tired? How do you take a picture that says exhaustion? This is an early frame on a trip to the south face of Nuptse. This is my friend Kevin here. And we were exhausted. We were so tired. And honestly, I didn't want to take pictures at that time. That was not something that was really in my brain to do. I wanted to go to bed. I wanted to make tea, melt some water, make dinner, go to bed. But I knew that that face was going to haunt me in my brain if I didn't try and make a picture of it. So I sat with Kevin in the tent, we made dinner, and we went through all these motions together. And finally, you know, I shot the whole time, and he was very conscious of the camera, but it was a great example of what it means to shoot through a situation. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to shoot right up until you know you have the moment. This was one of those times where I really had to work hard to keep shooting because I wasn't getting what I wanted. But finally, he let his guard down. He stopped paying attention to me. I was waiting for Freddie to be outside, and that using that window of the tent, the window light comes in, it gives this dramatic light on Kevin, it gives him this beautiful catch light in his eye, and backlights the breath coming out of his mouth. That moment to me spoke volumes about adventure as a whole and the human experience because it shows exhaustion. It just shows it. You can see it, you can feel it, you're there with it. That kind of attention to the human element of this is really what brought me into wanting to tell a bigger story when I went to Pakistan in 2010, 2011. It was the winter time, and we were base camped right next to a military encampment on the border. This is an active conflict zone, a conflict zone between India and Pakistan. And because we were there in the winter, the soldiers were really okay with us coming and hanging out with them. In the summertime, that doesn't happen. But again, I was looking for those unexpected things that told how hard it was to live there. This guy and this guy are wearing exactly the same outfit. This guy just got here, bright white, brand new. This guy's been here about 4 weeks. It shows you how dirty and how hard it is. These moments, you have to shoot through them. You have to find the time where these two things come together. I saw that juxtaposition and I waited for two soldiers to start talking. And granted, you can see that I was having some problems with my lens. It was fogging. That's what happens when you go from a warm situation to a cold one or vice versa. But it doesn't matter, right? Like, it's okay that it's a little bit fogged over here. You got to shoot through those situations. You got to know that this moment is not going to happen again. I wanted to incorporate a lot of the elements of basically the textures of what these guys were living in and going through. The frayed Pakistani flag, the huge mountain backdrop, the fiberglass igloo with the draped canvas over the top of it, all of that comes together to really give you a sense of the hardship of what it feels like to live there, to feel what it feels like to live on an open battlefield, the highest open battlefield in the world. Of course, you want to incorporate the sense of human, young men with guns. That is always going to tell a big story. It's going to grab people right away. I don't think this image is necessarily the best image from the trip, but it does tell a story. It tells a story not only of this big mountain environment, but what it means to move through it. Why are they moving through it with guns? It creates questions. You want people to answer questions, ask questions. You want them to dive into the picture, read the caption, and read the article, right? This is a big piece of adventure. You have to grasp an audience. You have to give them something more, something to hold on to. This is one of my favorite images from this trip. Why in the world is there a bright purple tracksuit hanging from a clothesline in the highest, in the highest mountains in the world? That makes no sense. It's so unexpected. It's so weird. And why are they hanging clothes out to dry anyway? I mean, if your clothes are wet up here, you hang them out to freeze. They don't dry. But I thought it was so fascinating and so wonderful. And this is when I started to really bridge that gap between being disconnected from these guys and just taking outside portraits to actually working very closely with them and being invited into their living space. And this is where it starts to get really, really intimate and good, because you're starting to feel this closeness with them. In this case, I didn't really, I think I like this image. I like the flare. I like the composition, the difference of light. I don't even mind that he's looking at me. But that was the first time I sent this to an editor, and she said, I don't like the eye contact. I know you're in that situation. So I had to go back and I had to rework it. And this was my solution to that. I wanted to get that making tee shot, that camaraderie, being inside. I wanted to get the steam. And this to me was a better execution of that. I was not there. I was not present. Nobody was paying attention to me. That's what makes it a better photograph to me. We have to think of ourselves as observers who are not there. The minute somebody starts to make eye contact with you, if it's not a portrait, people who are looking at that photograph are aware that a photographer is there. So you want to remove yourself as much as you can from it. You want to tell this story so you can tell this story. You can tell the bigger narrative of what it means to be fighting in a very, very arduous, hard battle that is in some ways very broken. The whole image here is meant to speak to that concept of a broken war, a broken conflict, a conflict that's been going on for years and years and years. Young men are dying all the time to elements, to the mountains, to conflict, all of that. And this image really was the conclusion to that. That's the human story without showing humans again. Incorporating shadow, creative use of light, shooting directly into the sun, stopping down to get that bright sun star. And even the wreckage, even the shadow of the wreckage seems broken. And that's what I was trying to communicate, is that this is a broken war. So we're using images to tell a story that we really, really want to say. We want to drive a point home. So we've talked a little bit about using big landscape and little people to really tell a big adventure story. This is a great example of that. You've got the small person right down here, you got the big landscape, right? But what we haven't really talked about yet is anticipation. Anticipation of a moment is a huge thing. This moment is never going to happen again. This is truly an honest moment. You can't recreate it. I saw what was happening. We're very, very high on Gasherbrum 2 in the middle of winter on the first winter ascent. The sun was coming up. I was miserable. I was cold. I was scared. It was beautiful weather. And the sun was just going to come up. And this is the hardest part of the day. But talking about anticipation, I knew that as soon as Dennis was going to come up over this, he was going to get hit by this sun ray, right? And this sun that was raking across here. So when I was back around here where this guy Simone is, I actually started running uphill. I mean, running at 7,400 meters is very, very hard to do. I was exhausted, I was dehydrated, I didn't have enough food, and I was nauseous just from the altitude. So I started running uphill, and as soon as I got to this point, the first thing I did was I stopped and I actually vomited. But I knew that this moment was worth that. I knew it was important enough that this was absolutely worth that pain that I was going to put myself through. And sure enough, Dennis, walking up behind me, the sun hits him. The sun's just on the top of Masherbrum back here. Beautiful, beautiful moment. It's never going to happen again. And honestly, this is not technically perfect. It's not technically perfect because my camera was frozen. I couldn't change the setting, but that's okay. It's a little bit soft in here. That's okay. That's what moment is about. If it's a great, true, honest moment, composition, sharpness, all of that, it comes secondary. This will never ever happen again, and you have to be able to anticipate those moments as they're gonna happen. That's a huge part of working in a very dynamic and active environment. How do you anticipate moments, real moments? You have to look around, you have to be constantly aware. And we've talked about how you have to get close to tell those moments sometimes. We've talked about what it feels like to have ice on your face, what it means to dive into people, but sometimes also telling the story of a place is about using a little bit more refined tools. I often get asked when I show this body of work, how did I get a studio image out in the field? Well, this isn't a studio image. This is just basic, very creative use of lighting. I want to tell the story of the Sherpa in Himalaya, and this was a photo project that I worked on for several years. But I wasn't going to take backdrops with me or anything like that. So what I did was I started seating people in their doorways. So they get this open shade on their face. I use a little bit of flash fill with a ring flash, a fabricated ring flash around it, and it drops away to blackness behind them. It's very, very simple. You have to use all the tools at your disposal to create the images, the kinds of images that you want to create. You can't always be in a studio. It just doesn't work. It's never going to work. You have to be able to create that look out in the field. This series was very, very important to me because it taught me exactly that. I had to be able to find ways to make images that looked more like I was shooting in a studio, looked more set up, that although we were out right there in their own homes. I also, because of that, started thinking about how I could tell bigger stories about adventure without even showing adventure. Right? That was the next logical step for me. This is what we think of when we think of Everest. We think of the industry that's been created down here. These lights here, that's base camp. Thousands of people go there every year to climb this mountain, right? Thousands of Sherpas, porters, and hundreds of climbers come to climb Everest. That's what we think of, and we usually get stuck right here. That's where we stop. I started thinking, how do I tell the story of Everest without even showing Everest? Without showing climbing. So I took a radical departure. I took all of the things that I had learned from working in the field with portraits, and I tried to make images that told the story of Everest without ever seeing it. This is Ed Webster, and as you start to look at this portrait, you see that he's missing all 5 fingertips. That's from frostbite from climbing Everest, right? This is a portrait of Everest. This is a portrait of adventure, but you're not seeing anything. This is Norbu Tenzing Norgay. Okay, this is the son of one of the first man to climb Everest. Norbu Tenzing Norgay is a huge figure in the Sherpa community. I asked him about the loss of his friends on Everest. This is what he showed me. His cousins, his family members who have died climbing Everest. This is what he gave me. That's a portrait of Everest. That's a portrait of adventure. That is part of this. And we have to remember that we can tell big stories without ever showing mountains. It's a different way to do it, but that's what adventure is about. This is one of my friends, Conrad Anker, a huge mentor of mine. And I knew that we had been to Everest together and I had let him down. I knew that our trip had not been successful. And in order to get what I wanted to get out of Conrad in this situation, the expression that I needed to get from him, that raw, real, visceral moment that I keep talking about, I had to use a little bit of an ambush tactic. We were talking, we were having a nice friendly conversation. I said, Conrad, did I let you down? I said that right in the middle of the conversation. And he completely dropped his guard and looked away and he said, yes. He said, yeah, you did. You let me down. And that is that moment that I took that photograph. That's a story of Everest. This man is a story of Everest without seeing the mountain. That is part of this. We have to remember that all adventure is made through the people that engage in it. And it's so much more than just the actions. And all of this that I've learned through these early years in photography is that vulnerability and the human element that we bring to it, whether it's the people that support the adventures, whether it's the local culture, whether it's, the action itself, what really is adventure is the people that are involved. That's what it is. And when you can get people to open up in that vulnerability and that give you that vulnerable state, that's when you start to really connect people to what adventure means, how it works. This is a self-portrait I took of myself after I nearly died in an avalanche. This has become one of my most well-known pictures because I was vulnerable. I let myself be vulnerable to the camera. This is adventure. It's adventure without seeing anything. And that, I think, is what I've learned from all of this, is that we have to engage in all aspects of it. This is a people story. Adventure is about people. It's not about action. The more we can tell this, the better off we're going to be, and the more translatable all of our stories will be.